Okay, kind of a ham-fisted edit. A couple things I meant to mention in the front of the video. Symptoms of a fuel system restriction typically would be that when you're operating it at full throttle or pretty hard on the throttle and fairly high RPM, you'll start to get sort of a stutter as the fuel flow isn't sufficient to keep up with the engine's demand. The Rincon, talking to some other people, can sometimes exhibit atypical symptoms, that it might run fine for several minutes and then just quit. Typically when that would happen, I would suspect either a restriction in the fuel tank vent, which is on the fuel cap on these, of course, which once the machine sucks some fuel out of the tank, air can't get in to replace it. It pulls a partial vacuum and stops fuel flow. That's fairly easy to determine if that happened. If the machine stopped and you crack the fuel cap open for a minute and it immediately cures it, then you know you've got a problem with the tank vent. But in this case, that solution didn't change anything, so we knew it wasn't that. And after a period of time, the machine would restart, so it appeared to be temperature related, which to me, when you have something, when the machine gets hot and it quits, that often suggests electronics. But in his case, it was actually clogged up fuel filter sock. And apparently, in high temperatures and in high demand, it would cause the fuel pump itself to cut out, which is sort of an interesting way for it to fail. Usually an electric fuel pump, at least in my experience, it either runs or it doesn't. But in my case, I'm changing the fuel filter sock just because of the age of the machine and the miles that are on it. Although I'm pretty particular about keeping fuel clean, as you'll find in the video, that's fairly restricted. And also I apologize for the crummy focus in some of these. It's 104 I think out today, and I think I got some sweat on the camera, something like that. But hopefully it's clear enough that you'll be able to see what I'm talking about and how to put in this upgrade kit on this Rincon. Hello. Well, the next video we're going to do on the Rincon is on the fuel system. These have a electronic, the 680 anyway, has electronic fuel injection, and the fuel pump is mounted in kind of a sub-tank mounted beneath the tank. It's kind of a nice idea. A lot of times motorcycles go to fuel injection and the pump ends up in the tank and you end up losing gas capacity and range. And also you hear about failures that folks believe are temperature related, specifically that the pump doesn't like it when it's not run fully submerged. So in this little sub-tank, the fuel pump will be submerged until you actually run the thing out of fuel. Initially, the little sub-tank and pump was considered a sealed unit or whatever. You couldn't order parts for it or whatever. The fuel pressure test, a few other things. If it wasn't a wiring problem, you basically were supposed to replace the sub-tank that had the fuel pump in it. Eventually they had problems with a little filter sock in there that would plug up. For some reason people seem to be getting their gasoline contaminated with ethanol, and that doesn't do them any good. So they actually came out with this kit where the fuel sock was initially right at the bottom of the sub-tank. This sort of mounts a fuel sock alongside the pump so that it's less down in the sediment and separated water and that sort of thing. And this is Honda part 16706 HN8 305. Comes with the two O-rings that seal the top of that canister, a little thing that attaches to the pump, a little O-ring that goes onto this thing that attaches to the pump, and there's a lug there where this filter attaches to it, and then it comes with directions. So there's a 2-pin electrical connector to this sub-tank. There are two fuel lines with just a rubber or a just a normal wire spring clamp. The smaller one is a vent that runs up into the side of the main fuel tank, and the other one is fuel from the fuel tank. There's a little strainer in the fitting at the bottom of the tank, and that line runs into the sub-tank. Of course, you have to have a way for air to get out for the fuel to flow in and keep the sub-tank full. And then the third line coming off this little sub-tank would be the line that feeds the fuel injector. And that has, the hose has a little lock-on thing where you push a couple locking tabs to pop it off. You're supposed to replace the little locking tab and this little rubber piece that are on that fuel line whenever you disconnect them. And so those parts are 17711-SOX-A31 is the little locking clip, and the little rubber piece is going to be 16719HN8A61. And we'll come back here, I'll show you what that little sub-tank looks like. So here we are coming around on the right side of the machine here. So you've got your oil filter course, and here's that sub-tank. And it has a little rubber cover on it that kind of protects it. Hopefully you can see there's the locking tabs and that rubber piece. The two other lines just have normal wire clamps on them, and then there's a two-wire connection on it there, and two bolts hold the whole sub-tank thing onto a bracket here. So we'll go ahead and get that disconnected here in just a bit. One little tool that's super handy. I've siphoned out most of the gas out of the gas tank, but there's still going to be some coming from that larger line with the spring clamp. There'll still be gas in that line. So naturally I have some rags handy and a fire extinguisher as well, but these little clampy offy things are pretty handy for blocking a fuel line like that. And also I have an assortment of little rubber plugs too to put in the end. Lastly, it's not a bad idea to have a little plastic bag or something to protect the line going to the fuel injector. You really don't want to get any dirt in there, because naturally it gets pushed straight to the fuel injector, and you don't want to bugger that up. So I've got the two lines to the tank off. I'm having a hard time getting that fuel injector line to disconnect, and also seeing the 2-pin connector. So I see if you come around here by the front shock, those two bolts right there would hold the little sub-tank bracket, mounting bracket, onto the frame. So I'm going to go ahead and take those off. Well, that was a tremendous pain in the tuchus, but here it is. For some reason, the one side of this little push clip deal here didn't want to release. Had that off before, obviously, to take the tank off for valve adjustments and so on. Haven't had that kind of a struggle. There's the 2-pin connector has a little lock on it on the back side of the connector that you press, and there you can see the vent and incoming fuel from the fuel tank there. So I'll clean it up a little bit and chuck it in the vise here and take that cover ring off, and kind of go from there. So here's a better look of what's in the package with this upgrade kit. We've got the filter, a little blue plug in it where it attaches, this little adapter housing type thing, a little O-ring, two big O-rings, and this is that rubber tab and the locking clip that I took off the old pump. I have new ones to put on. Then it also came with this direction sheet. This basically remove the fuel pump filter, release the locking tabs, part 1, on the fuel pump unit holder from the grooves in the fuel unit base hooks while pushing the holder against the unit base and slightly spreading the base unit hook. Remove the fuel pump holder from the fuel pump base. Install new fuel filter pump unit holder, I guess is this white plastic thing here, to the fuel pump unit while aligning the holes for the suction port and 3 locking tabs with the grooves. Make sure the fuel pump unit holder is securely connected and that the locking tabs are firmly locked into place. Install the fuel pump filter. Apply silicone grease to a new O-ring and install it to the suction port of the fuel pump unit holder. Install fuel pump filter onto fuel pump unit holder while aligning the suction port. So that must be the suction port of the fuel pump holder onto which we're supposed to attach this filter. Then on the back side it says hold the fuel pump filter as shown and push the unit until it's fully seated on the fuel pump unit holder. Engage the fuel pump filter hooks to the fuel pump unit holder bosses by turning the fuel pump filter in the direction as shown. Make sure the fuel pump unit holder securely connected and that the locking tabs are firmly locked into place. That's pretty much all it says. So I went ahead and put a match mark on this ring, the housing, and the top of the fuel pump housing here, and we'll go ahead and unbolt this and go from there. So I brushed some of the dirt off of this, pulled that ring and those screws out, and this assembly was actually stuck in there more than you'd expect. I had to kind of gently pry it out. I think it was just the force of that inner O-ring. But anyway, so here is the existing fuel pump housing. That must be those 3 tabs they're talking about. Looks like that's the inlet from the tank, drops down to the bottom here. Inside this little sub-tank is actually quite clean. I'll go ahead and make sure it's absolutely spotless, and we'll go ahead and pull out those 2 old O-rings and go from there with this pump. So it says that the first step is to remove the fuel filter, and if you can see there, you can tell it looks like you twist it that way and pull it off. So there's the old filter. Looks like it's kind of due to be changed, to say the least. And there's that port. So it says the next step is to pull these locking clips out, I guess, and pop this, which I don't think I'll be able to do on camera. Okay, per the instructions, I kind of pushed this base downward while pulling these 3 tabs out until they snapped off. They're kind of hook-shaped. And that released this, exposing the pump. I also went ahead and just pulled these 2 connectors out so I had a little more room to work around the wire. It says install the new pump holding unit to the fuel pump unit while aligning the holes for the suction port and 3 locking tabs. So I guess this goes on like so. Oops. Like so, that is. And I'll have to do that with 2 hands. Okay, so I really had a hard time pushing that housing into that base to get the locking tabs to snap. I eventually just took the pump out of the housing, shoved it up in here until its suction end ended up in the little hole there. I actually had to push on it pretty hard. I was
I couldn't tell before what was binding, but I think that was it. So I've got that in there. Now I'll try to get it locked into the housing. Alright, that didn't go on real easily either, but got it in there and made sure all three locking tabs are fully snapped into place. Clearance, there's a little plastic separator there between the wires, and making sure those wires are on either side of that seemed to help get it to snap in. So it says next to put some silicone lubricant on the O-ring and install the filter. Looking at the filter, it has two little hooks there, and there's little prongs there, so it looks to me like you put it on like that and twist it so it ends up sitting in here like that. So that snapped on fairly easily. Push it in and turn it, and it clicked. It also says to make sure there's two alignment arrows there, make sure they're lined up, indicating that's all the way on, and to double check these tabs. Oddly, there was no O-ring between the pump itself and this new housing, but then there was no O-ring between the pump and the old filter either, and it was a pretty dang tight fit, so I'd imagine it won't be sucking any unfiltered fuel through that way. So it looks like it's put some silicone on the big O-rings and put it back in the can. Okay, so that's got that. Yeah. Ended up putting silicone around the flange of the plastic piece here for that one big O-ring, and kind of jiggled it by hand. I don't like to crunch down O-rings using fasteners, and it's really easy to pinch something and cut it. It was kind of a bugger to get it started in there straight, and once I did, I hand tightened the screws and then just went in a crisscross pattern, snugging them down pretty good. So the next thing to do will be to put on that rubber piece and that clip real quick. So this is the 16719 HN8 rubber piece, and it just goes on that line to the fuel injector, and you just kind of stretch it over the little boss on that line. And then this little clip piece snaps onto that, and that's what clamps on your line for the fuel injector, so the pressure can't push that one off. So that should be ready to go back in the machine.
Okay, so final thought with this, with a fuel system, of course, it's especially critical to double check for leaks. Once I've got everything connected up here, put some fuel in the tank, look it over good for leaks, cycled the key on to run the pump, and it turned out I did have a little bit of a seepage there, so I ended up taking things out, just making sure everything was on square and tight, and checking it again, and looks like everything's good. I'll check it the next day too, just to after I've washed everything or whatever, just to make sure everything's absolutely bone dry, since these tend to ride in pickups or in toy haulers or whatever. You don't want fuel to be leaking anywhere.
So we're getting right down here, looking at everything and feeling, and it's absolutely bone dry. The machine runs good, so it looks like we're good to go. Thanks for watching.